All right, we're ready for our final layer. Are you ready? Okay. Finn, I'm going to welcome you up to the stage and tell us a little bit more about our past, present, and future places.
Thank you very much. Great. That was beautiful. Thanks, Ina. So I'm going to talk about wisdom as a form of perspective on time. And I think one thing that does distinguish us from non-human species is this ability to kind of see sense in the past, to understand the future, to be prospective, to look forward. And I think writers from Martin Seligman to Roman Krasnarich talk about this as a way of, it's kind of a unique ability we've had, and it's the ability that's enabled us to build these cities that then non-human species also interact with and take part in. And I think that ability to look backwards and forwards means the further we look forwards, the deeper we have to look backwards. When you ask what will a city in southern Sweden look like in 2050, it's only 27 years away. Look 27 years back, and the Öresundsbridge was already under construction. In fact, the idea was first proposed properly in 60 years ago. And I think the first ideas about a crossing between Copenhagen and Malmö was back in the late 1800s. So, 27 years is perhaps a long time in tech, but a very short time in the wisdom of cities. And I think if we want to understand what the future of a wise city looks like, we need to look back further. If you look back to a kind of an established architecture, a vernacular, a local dialect of architecture in Malmö, you can stand on Lilla Torg and look at some of the old half-timbered housing from hundreds of years ago. And there is an inherent wisdom in this kind of architecture. It's connected very deeply to the geography of this place. The brick comes from the mud. The half-timbering comes from a lack of availability of timber, whereas in northern Sweden, you'd clad the whole thing in wood. Elsewhere, layer cleaning in that old traditional architecture has a connection to the lime that we can dig out from under Malmö. The roof form has a connection to the climate of Malmö, our kind of infamous wind and rain that drives in across the Öresund. And even the crafts and techniques that we use to make this have a connection to Malmö's culture and our trade in skills and expertise with Copenhagen, with Denmark, with Netherlands, with Germany. So this is an architecture that really belonged to its place. And there's something quite amazing that it's also so deeply connected to the depth of time in that place. The lime that we're digging out of kalkbrottet, or we were digging out of the kalkbrottet, goes down to crushed animals from 65 million years ago. Interesting, though, that the industry that developed out of the kalkbrott in Malmö, Skånska Cementgjuteriet, then became, of course, Skanska, which is one of a number of actors who've been part of a centralization and a standardization of construction in Sweden over the last 100 or the last century. And are now producing an architecture that has a very different relationship to place. This was some visualizations of a scheme that's actually I saw inside one of the sheds over here in Varvstaden. And this is architecture that's produced in a factory somewhere else using materials that have been shipped in from somewhere else that has very little connection in its materiality or its identity to Malmö as a place. I mean, the visualization here, not necessarily the industrial building. And this is an architecture that produces lots of hidden externalities, hidden costs. Architecture that's based on cheap decisions that work now that actually pass on those costs to future generations, particularly in terms of a lack of sustainability. As going back to Roman Krasnarich, he talks about this as a way of, by making unsustainable decisions now, we're kind of colonizing the future. We're taking privileges or possibilities away from future generations. So how do we shift to a wiser form of architecture and planning today in today's context? Well, some clues are right next door, just over there. Where we're around the corner, but this in 1910 was the seafront of Malmö, built out from the seafront that used to be by the Malmö Castle. And you can see in what Varvstaden are doing now, where they're keeping a lot of the most characterful industrial structures, transforming them into commercial and educational buildings, and then dismantling a lot of the larger sheds from more recent times, but then keeping the materials, cataloguing them, and using them as a database, which is the first place that architects look when they're building or refurbishing existing buildings. So Varvstaden expects to be able to reuse and recycle 80% of the materials that are already on site, and that in theory is estimated to save 30,000 tons of CO2. These are one of the big traverse beams that have been cut in half and will be used to prop up extensions to the Svets or Panverkstaden that Open Studio are working on. I think what's interesting about this is reuse is not only reducing carbon emissions and the costs of buying new materials, but it's also investing new architecture with a real sense of place. Varvstaden is being built from Varvstaden, and it feels like that new architecture really belongs there. So what seemed like a kind of radical idea for the construction industry is increasingly, I think, seeming more and more sensible. We've seen through the shocks of COVID and Ukraine the impact on global supply chains and the increasing cost of materials from timber to steel to bricks. And that's made us, I think, increasingly aware of how fragile the wider geographies of the materials we're bringing in are. And at the same time, I think there's a greater shift from understanding sustainability is rather than just looking at the efficiency of buildings, we're looking increasingly to how they perform across their whole life, but also how sustainable they are in their construction, where those materials are sourced from. And this is an amazing example, which is a film by Martin Lang that he's produced in collaboration with White, that examines the true externalities, the environmental costs of Skellefteå, that White's building in Skellefteå, which they built entirely in wood, and shows, as Ina was talking about, the ecological and impacts of a timber industry that seems sustainable in some dimensions, but may not be sustainable in other ones. A very brave film for White to make and show at the Venice Biennale. And I think what we're now going to see increasingly is that with the EU bringing in taxes to do with whole life carbon and shipping and of course whole life carbon standards, if we're looking forward in the future, kind of scenario I'm interested in looking at is a future where we no longer make any buildings from scratch. In fact, a future where we might have to make buildings entirely from what's already here, both existing materials but also byproducts. And I think, that this kind of attitude is something I'm quite familiar with. It's nothing that new. It's something I'm very familiar with from London. And there's some lovely examples that really contribute to the quality of the city. These are the bollards, some of the original bollards that were put up in London using canons that we stole from the French after we beat them in the Battle of Trafalgar. But they became such an iconic form of bollard that now all new bollards that you buy, off a catalogue are in the canon shape. In the Second World War, there was a big push to melt down iron railings across the city to be able to build ships and army vehicles. Turned out that the technology wasn't really there, didn't really work. So all the railings that had been stored were just thrown into the Thames, probably making a good ecosystem for life in the Thames. But the kind of unexpected consequence of that was there was a lot more open space and accessible space in the city. It broke down barriers in the city. And then a more recent example on a similar theme is an amazing charity called Steel Warriors that melts down knives that are taken off the streets in London and elsewhere in the UK and builds street gyms out of them. At a larger scale, London's been amazing at recycling infrastructure, both taking long-sighted, wise decisions about investing in infrastructure like Joseph Bazalgette's sewers, the northern outfall sewer and the eastern outfall sewer, that have then become very different landscapes, incredible pieces of biodiversity that contribute to London's health in a totally different way, walking and cycling links at this high level across the city. Or other bits of infrastructure like the railways that cut across London, which have all of these railway arches underneath that have created an ecosystem of small businesses, startups, mechanics, manufacturers, breweries, food companies that kind of thread throughout the city and really give a vital contribution to the economy. So what does this look like in Malmö? How wise is Malmö in reusing infrastructure that we've inherited from previous generations? I think the first place to start is our streets. There's a nice quote from an urbanist, Lars Marcus, who talks about, we have to ask ourselves, what's smart? Is it the app that needs to be replaced every other year, or is it the street network that has lasted for hundreds of years and handled generations of technology from horses and carts to trams, cars, and now electric vehicles? This is one of our streets being rebuilt for Malmö's new electric buses. And I think there's an inherent wisdom and technology in a lot of the stuff that we take for granted every day. But there's also some pretty spectacular examples of reusing infrastructure. Bulltoftefeltet, this is the airport runway that was closed in 1972. And it's not just Berlin that has Tempelhof. Malmö's got our own version. Kiseberg Vattentorn, that was a water tower built in the late 1800s, converted into emergency housing in the space of kind of 6 months in 1916, but still a really important building for Kiseberg. Slakthuset, which was designed by one of my predecessors, Salomon Sorensen, in 1904, then became a legendary club, now hosts legendary conferences, and Stapelbedsparken. So Stapelbed, one of the original docks where the ships were built by Kockums and others, and then in collaboration with Bryggeriet, turned into one of the largest skate parks in Malmö in 2005. And Södervalsbassängen, also part of that industrial heritage, but now this ongoing project to raise the level of the water so we can almost see it from part of the room, from 11 meters deep to 3 to 4 meters deep, using old clay and stone and sand to bring more light to the bottom to make it safer, but also to create the conditions for allgrass or seagrass to grow, which helps bind in carbon dioxide, but also creates conditions for a richer ecology and will make it safer to swim. And then Nyhamnen, further over there, where we're starting now a major new regeneration project. And here I think what we're increasingly doing is looking much harder at the existing qualities and infrastructure of the place and thinking how we can work with them. We've got a live project right now as part of Malmö in the Making with two fantastic teams, one based in Nyhamnen, one based in Rosengård, who are looking at how they can map all the existing resources, not just the material resources, but also the immaterial resources, the knowledge, the cultures, the intelligence, the skills in an area, and take that as the starting point for long-term urban regeneration in both Nyhamnen and Rosengård, which are our two priority areas for change in the city. In Limhamn, you mentioned Limhamn and difficulty of closing a street. Well, this is an interesting project with Limhamn Silos, which has actually become an incredibly, had become an incredibly interesting ecology, and a project we're working on to redevelop the silos, keep some of them, is also looking very deeply at the qualities of that ecology that built up over time and make sure that in the new landscaping and in the new architecture, we build a space for those species to continue to exist and connect with the kind of the new ecologies that are built up around the kalkbrottet as well. And then there's some extraordinary spaces that that are still up for grabs and still in the process of being worked on, from Kampen to Lokstallene. And I think it's these kind of extraordinary scale of infrastructure that was built for something totally different, things that we've inherited, but they're opportunities for us to maintain something extraordinary and unexpected in Malmö, and spaces that we really need to take care of. Two last examples, and I think this is about how we can build some flexibility into the way we work in the future, particularly in relation to technology and how that's changing cars, the way we use cars and transport. But this is Amaralsgatan that divides Rosengård in two, and there's this. I think there are opportunities perhaps in the same way that things like canals 80 years ago was seen as something very dirty, infrastructure you wouldn't even want to build close to. Perhaps the same will happen with motorways and roads in the future. When technology changes, we'll have a very different attitude to what we need in terms of road space. And these could become the most important public spaces of the future in Malmö. And similarly with car parks, we're speaking to Per Malmö about how we can build into car parks the opportunity to not just have cars, but also accommodate different uses over time, particularly if car usage shrinks in different areas. This is the largest timber car park in Sweden, in Sege Park. Just want to end with an example which I think is probably the most concrete, perhaps not the right choice of word, example of where we're heading, where we could be heading to discover this wise architecture for Malmö, this kind of new Malmö vernacular. For me, it's closely linked to this idea of non-extractive architecture that Joseph Grima writes about, this idea of understanding the true impacts of everything we build beyond the place, from supply chains to how we build it to how it's maintained. And it's an amazing project in Arles. It's Atelier Luma. And it's by BC Architects and some friends of mine in London called Assemble. And they talk about this as bio-regional design. And they say we need to move from globalized extractive supply chains towards regional ecosystems of materials that help regenerate the environment. Where others might see waste, we see opportunities. So what they've done with this project is see the place as a kind of quarry. They've looked around it. They've got terrazzo using broken roof tiles from the existing building. The internal walls are made from rammed earth using demolition debris and limestone dust from local quarries. The door handles and cladding panels are made from salt from the local salt marshes. The bathroom tiles are made from waste clay from local quarries. And acoustic insulation is made from byproducts of the local sunflower industry. So there's, again, it doesn't have to look like half timbering to have a connection to an environment. There's a very different way that we can develop new materials and connections with nature and our environment and our cultures in a place that could generate a new architecture that feels specific to its place. This is one of the interiors of Atelier Luma. So what does that mean for Malmö? What will our local vernacular look like? And another falafel stall, not so many seagulls on it this time, but there generally are. And I think it is interesting, this relationship to food. Carolyn Steele was mentioned before, and she obviously talks a lot about local and regional food systems that prioritize kind of locally sourced produce. What does the equivalent look like for architecture? I think we're all conscious of that kind of concept when we go and eat somewhere. But what kind of new generation of local circular vernacular architecture could that produce? What kind of cultural palimpsest that doesn't just capture the material, physical relationships with the place, but also captures the cultural richness we have in Malmö? I think we've kind of done that through food. And I'm really excited in seeing what that could now look like for architecture. Thank you.